If you think the psychedelic light show they're putting on is futuristic, you should go backstage and see the technology that's producing it. I feel I've been transported into the future. It's what our North American friends would call awesome. In this case, it really is awesome. The species we would like to be. What a fascinating title for a conference. I'm guessing most contributors will be concerned with the historical timescale of decades, centuries, millennia. On that timescale, something rather like evolution goes on, but many orders of magnitude faster. We can see this in the evolution of technology, the evolution of our artifacts such as cars or planes. But cars and planes are just conspicuous examples of the evolution-like process that we call cultural evolution. Other examples are the evolution of language or clothes fashions or architectural styles. My own field is the longer timescale of evolution, like Dr. Brian Farrell, whom we heard this morning. The difference between the timescales is so huge that we can accommodate them only if we use something like a logarithmic scale, using powers of 10. Where appropriate, I'll try to give an idea of each timescale by looking into the past as well as into the future. Timescale of decades, short-term political progress. What we see in the way of cultural evolution at this timescale concerns things like the position of women in society. I find it a shattering fact that in most countries of the world, women still didn't have the right to vote 100 years ago. 70 years ago, almost to the day, women got the vote in Chile, which means that there are women alive today who, when they were by modern standards old enough to vote, were not allowed to vote, still living today. Timescale of centuries, 10 to the 2. Here we detect an evolution-like changes in language. The language of Chaucer is largely unintelligible to people of today. Moral values, too, change on this timescale. A few centuries ago, slavery was the accepted norm. Now it horrifies us. What is the equivalent accepted practice today which will horrify us 100 years in the future? On this timescale of centuries, we may speculate on the future of democratic systems. Will we develop democratic safeguards against the kind of catastrophe that American democracy wished upon the world in 2016? This is the timescale on which we may expect truly catastrophic consequences of man-made climate change. 10 to the 3, timescale of millennia. If our species survives that long, we might see world government on this timescale. Perhaps we might send colonies to Mars. 10 to the 4, timescale of tens of millions of years. The timescale on which, when we look into the past, we see the evolutionary divergence between human races, tropical versus Arctic, desert dwellers versus forest dwellers, and so on. Looking into the future, I suppose this is the timescale on which we might see interstellar travel beyond our parochial solar system, either by sleeping travelers or by our robotic descendants. 10 to the 5, timescale of hundreds of thousands of years. Now we come to the fringe of what might conventionally be called the evolutionary timescale. If we look back 100,000 or between 100,000 and a million years, we can just notice anatomical differences. Fossils such as Homo rhodesiensis, so-called broken hill skull from Zambia, is anatomically just detectably different from modern Homo sapiens. As I said, my own field is the longer time scale of evolution. We're now getting into really seriously long distances, long times ago. 10 to the 9 time scale of billions of years. That's the time scale on which, looking into the future, the end of the world will come, is when the sun will become a red giant and engulf the Earth. And sooner than that, life will become insupportable on this planet as the oceans boil. So true biological evolution is many orders of magnitude slower than cultural evolution. And of course, the reason it's slower is that it has to proceed generation by generation. Human generations are measured in decades. As you know, biological evolution is a two-stage process. Stage one is random genetic change, mutation. It's random only in the sense that it's not directed towards improvement. Improvement comes about only in stage two, selection, non-random survival, more strictly, non-random reproduction. You have to survive in order to reproduce, so non-random survival is normally a good approximation to non-random evolution. If you wanted to demonstrate the Darwinian process experimentally, what would you do? Generation after generation, you would choose to breed non-randomly in a particular direction. Corn or maize has a shorter generation time than humans, so it's possible to achieve significant evolutionary change on a timescale short enough to be seen in a human lifetime. And here on the graph we see artificial selection breeding for increased oil production in maize seeds. And you can see a rapid linear increase in oil production. At the same time, the experimenters bred in the opposite direction for reduced oil production. And again, the evolutionary change is more or less linear till it hits zero. Given enough time, could you, if you wanted to, breed humans in the same way? Could you, say, breed a champion high jumper or a brilliant musician? Well, of course you could. That doesn't mean we should want to. In fact, the idea is anathema to many people. The very word eugenics has become a dirty word, especially on the political left. That hasn't always been so, by the way. Before Hitler brought eugenics into universal disrepute, many left-wingers, such as J.B.S. Haldane, the great scientist, and George Bernard Shaw, the playwright, were advocates of eugenics. Marie Stopes, the great pioneer of birth control, was an extreme advocate of human eugenics. Today, the pendulum has swung the other way, as you know. Some people are so antagonistic to the idea of human eugenics, they try to argue that it's impossible, it couldn't work. And of course it could work. Just as you can turn a wolf into a bulldog or a dachshund, you obviously could turn a human into something, at least superficially, very different, including a world-beating athlete, mathematician, or musician. Many people, as I say, have moral objections. But some ideologues make the illogical leap from it would be very undesirable to therefore it isn't possible. And of course it would be possible whether we like it or not. No more impossible than with dogs or cabbages. For purposes of moral discussion, many people make the distinction between negative eugenics and positive eugenics. Negative eugenics is surely harmless if it simply means removing genes that everybody agrees are detrimental. This can now be done using in vitro fertilization, IVF. Hemophilia, for example, a terrible disease that gravely restricts freedom to enjoy life and usually results in early death. A female carrier of the recessive hemophilia gene has a 50% risk that any son will suffer from hemophilia itself. A couple can be advised of this when they decide they want a child, and then do in vitro fertilization, where a woman is injected with hormones, so she superovulates, produces perhaps a dozen eggs. These are surgically removed, fertilized, and grown in a dish. Then 2 or 3 of the dozen or so developing embryos are chosen at random and re-implanted in the woman. But they don't have to be chosen at random. You can screen the embryos genetically and re-implant only those from the 50% that lack the hemophilia gene. It's hard to see how anybody could object to voluntary negative eugenics of this kind. It's a far cry from the compulsory eugenics advocated by Hitler or Marie Stopes. Compulsory sterilization of people deemed to be inferior is indeed repugnant. It happened in America in the first half of the 20th century, and Hitler raised it to government policy. Even voluntary eugenics arouses great hostility when the idea is to design your own ideal baby. Doctor, please give us a blonde, blue-eyed baby with a talent for mathematics and music. Almost everybody today has qualms about positive eugenics. Perhaps, again, some of the hostility to the idea comes from the legacy of Hitler. But the title of this conference is The Species We Would Like to Be, and the very act of asking the question almost invites us to contemplate manipulating our own evolution. Again, it's perhaps worth making the distinction between voluntary and compulsory eugenics. Hitler wanted to breed his supermen by compulsory means. But allowing a couple to make a voluntary genetic choice when reimplanting embryos in IVF seemed significantly less morally repugnant. After all, people already try to force their child, sometimes against its will, to learn music. We may not like the idea, but we don't regard it with the sort of horror with which we might treat the idea of inserting a gene for musical genius, such as perhaps bless the family of Johann Sebastian Bach. Is it obviously so much less moral to bestow musical genes upon a child than to force the child to practice the piano for hours every day? Well, there are certainly problems with breeding for characteristics, either with genetic manipulation or selection, unforeseen consequences. If you select intensively for one thing, you don't know what other things you may be inadvertently changing, and that could be very bad. You can see this in bulldogs. The massive skull of bulldogs makes it very difficult for puppies to be born, and modern bulldogs are all born by caesarean section. By artificial selection, positive eugenics, racehorses have been bred for extreme speed. That means long, thin legs, which are easily breakable, and as you know, racehorses frequently do break their legs in races and have to be killed. Wild horses were also bred for speed by natural selection, running away from predators such as saber-toothed tigers or dire wolves. But natural selection would have resulted in a compromise between legs that were fast enough and legs that were too fast, i.e., too long and breakable. The very fastest horses would have been more likely to be caught by a saber-toothed tiger than a medium-fast horse, because the very fastest ones broke their legs and were then easy prey. Compromise is one of the most important features of evolution. A wild animal is a multi-dimensional compromise between perhaps hundreds of selection pressures, pushing in a variety of directions. Sexual selection, for example. The pressure to attract a mate often pushes in the opposite direction to the pressure to survive. A peacock is an extreme example of an animal that's been pushed far towards one end of the compromise spectrum. By the way, one attractive theory of the rapid expansion of the human brain, which I'll mention later, is that it's a kind of mental peacock's tail. Intelligence is sexy. As I said earlier, random mutation and non-random selection are the two halves of the Darwinian process. We've been doing artificial selection for millennia and centuries, but never, as it happens, or almost never, with humans. Artificial mutation has only recently become possible. You meet it under names like genetic manipulation or genetic engineering. Maybe in the centuries that follow, we'll practice genetic engineering of humans. But the fact that we have not done artificial selection with humans during all the centuries where we have been doing it with dogs might make you wonder, if we'd never manipulated the selection half of the Darwinian formula, why would we suddenly start doing it to the mutation half? This genetically modified cat glows in the dark. It has a gene imported by genetic engineers from fluorescent jellyfish. It seems unlikely that anyone will want to breed fluorescent humans, but it is an indication of what could, in principle, be done. Again, only if you wanted to. And as with artificial selection, of humans, almost nobody today wants to. But again, in a conference entitled The Species We Would Like to Be, we can hardly refrain from at least mentioning it. And as with the example of a couple with ambitions for their child to become a musical genius, is there so much moral distinction between forcing a child to practice the piano and inserting musical genes into an embryo, which would make it a lot easier to play the piano? This latter technology, by the way, is not yet possible. We don't know enough to do it. The first of my timescales, the timescale of decades, will include the widespread adoption, which may even become compulsory, of self-driving cars. We've heard them mentioned already at this conference. And it's going to raise in earnest a moral dilemma which has become a favorite of moral philosophers, the so-called trolley problem. You are standing by the points on a railway line. A runaway trolley comes towards you. If it goes straight on, it will kill 5 men on the line. You have a choice to switch the points, in which case it will kill only 1 man. Which do you choose? Most people choose to switch the points and kill the 1 man. But we now alter the problem. You're standing on a bridge. The only way to stop the runaway trolley running under the bridge is to drop a heavy object in front of it. And the only available heavy object is a very fat man on the bridge. Do you push the fat man? Most people say no. Yet, what's the difference between the two cases? Perhaps it's what Immanuel Kant identified as the prohibition against using a person, even for a possibly moral purpose. Well, so far it's just an academic question, and a series of similar dilemmas has spawned a whole genre of trolleyology in the field of moral philosophy. But trolleyology has now suddenly become more than merely academic. Self-driving cars are going to have to be programmed in advance to make exactly the kind of decision we've been talking about. In the case of this cartoon, the car is bound to kill either the baby or the old lady. Which should it choose? An ambitious big data project has sampled the opinions of literally millions of people all over the world, and opinions differ in different cultures. In cultures that respect the elderly, people vote to save the old lady. In other cultures, such as the so-called West, people vote to spare the life of the baby. Which vote should the car manufacturers favor when designing the car? Or should they ignore popular votes altogether and seek advice from academic moral philosophers? Returning to the evolution timescale, which is my own field, the commonest question I'm asked after lectures is, can we predict our possible future evolution? For example, might the trend of the past 3 million years continue for the next 3 million years? The dominant trend of the past 3 million years is enlargement of the brain. It seems to inflate like a balloon. So might that trend continue into the future? Might we evolve in the future to have even bigger brains? The suggestion chimes with the idea that evolution is inherently progressive. Progress has long been a controversial word in evolution. At one extreme is, for example, Julian Huxley, also Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, and Herbert Spencer, who see evolution as a great universal drive towards progressive improvement. Julian Huxley went so far as to base his entire ethical system on evolutionary progress. He pretty much defined the good as that which fosters evolutionary progress or harmonizes with evolutionary progress. At the other extreme are those like Stephen Jay Gould, who completely deny that evolution is progressive at all. Gould was hostile to evolutionary progress, but it's the familiar trope of the... Okay. Gould was hostile to evolutionary progress, but mainly because he assumed that progress meant progress towards humanity. Obviously, if that's what you mean by progress, any good biologist would be hostile to the idea of it in evolution. But that isn't a good definition of evolutionary progress. When a complex organ, such as the vertebrate eye, evolves, it's obvious that the early stages had to be inferior to later stages, and that the evolutionary improvement had to be step-by-step progressive. The evolution of any complex organ must have come about in a large number of steps of progressive evolution. How do we know there are many steps rather than just one or two? By elementary probability theory. The parts of a complex machine like an eye could be rearranged at random in 1,000,000 ways before you hit another arrangement that could see. Something so statistically improbable cannot sensibly be explained as the result of a single stroke of luck. It has to be generated by a gradual, step-by-step natural selection process, which is inherently progressive. And something like that progressive evolution seems to have been going on in the expansion, the inflation of the human brain over the past few million years. On the other hand, we must resist the temptation to think there's some kind of internal momentum. There's no reason to suspect anything analogous to momentum in evolution. A trend will continue into the future only if the selection pressure of the past continues into the future. If the brain got bigger during the 3 million years since Lucy, the famous fossil, it can only be because natural selection favored big-brained individuals. Natural selection had to favor a bigger brain. Maybe they were better at surviving. Perhaps clever individuals were better hunters. Maybe they were better at reproducing. Perhaps because cleverness was attractive to the opposite sex, as I mentioned before. Maybe bigger-brained individuals were better at outwitting rivals of the same species, the so-called Machiavellian intelligence hypothesis. But one way or another, the trend continued in the past only because of natural selection. Nothing like momentum was operating. And therefore, the trend towards bigger brains will continue on into the future only if brainier individuals have more children. And what do you think? In any case, such speculation is pointless if we're going to go extinct. A huge majority of all the species that have ever lived went extinct without leaving any descendants. Is there any reason to think we shall escape that fate? The dinosaurs, it is now virtually certain, went extinct as a result of a major catastrophe. A large projectile from outer space, an asteroid or comet, collided with what is now the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. The relative velocity of the impact was beyond easy imagining, perhaps 50,000 kilometers per hour. The energy released in the form of heat and shock waves was equivalent to millions of Hiroshima bombs, all detonated together. Those animals not killed outright would have succumbed to the equivalent of a nuclear winter when darkness covered the earth because of an all-enveloping cloud of dust and smoke blocking the sun. Our mammal ancestors somehow managed to survive, perhaps because they were hibernating underground. Could we survive another impact like that one? We have a better chance than the dinosaurs did. As the saying goes, we have the technology. Or if we don't quite have it yet, we have the science with which we can develop the technology. Could we even deflect an incoming asteroid or comet and send it on its way harmlessly? First, we have to predict the looming danger. It's not that the projectile comes hurtling straight towards us like a speeding bullet. Rather, the comet or asteroid has an elliptical orbit, and we have an elliptical orbit, almost circular. By measuring orbits, we can compute whether at some future time a detected comet's orbit will intersect with ours. If it will, then all we have to do is change the projectile's orbit, either by speeding it up slightly or slowing it down slightly. We only have to change its velocity by a small amount in either direction. Only a few kilometers per hour would suffice. The Rosetta mission of the European Space Agency has already solved the difficult problem of landing on a comet. Now all we have to do is land not just a camera, but the means to slow down or speed up the trajectory of the comet. We're not so far off being able to do this, and could do it on the timescale of centuries, if not perhaps decades. We need the political will to do the necessary groundwork in advance, probably by international cooperation. And it might be the kind of project that could bring nations together as few others could. But that's not the only threat to our survival. Of course, there's climate change, which everybody is now aware of, or not enough people are now aware of, and which has been and will be mentioned at this conference. Nuclear war, of course, biological weapons, which potentially could get into the wrong hands, perhaps into the hands of people who, for religious reasons, actually want to die, which would be a new situation. I'll leave those things aside and go to one of the questions that the organizers have put to this conference. Does science teach us anything about the purpose of our existence? Evolutionary biology teaches us that the ultimate purpose of all living things is preservation and propagation of the genes that made them. We're not condemned to act out the dictates of our selfish genes. As the distinguished psychologist Steven Pinker said, he has no intention of having children, and if his selfish genes don't like it, they can go jump in the lake. Some people have trouble reconciling that with the idea that gene propagation is our ultimate goal. It is our ultimate goal, the ultimate goal of all living things. But reflect that we defy our selfish genes every time we use contraception. Natural selection builds a nervous system, a brain, that has proximal goals subservient to the ultimate goal of gene survival. We enjoy sex. That's the proximal goal. We enjoy sex, and that's enough in a state of nature to serve the end of gene propagation. And we can each set up proximal goals of our own, finishing writing a book, finishing a research project, writing a string quartet. We all have our own goals which make use of the goal-seeking mechanism, the sub-goal-seeking mechanism built by our genes into our brains. In a way, these proximal goal-seeking mechanisms can sometimes be seen as subverting the ultimate goal of gene preservation, and a good thing too. What is our role in the universe? Another of the questions put by the organizers. The Swedish physicist Max Tegmark has written a book, Life 3.0, which is a fantastic vision of a future dominated by artificial intelligence, which has been one of the main topics of this conference. Tegmark sees no reason why artificial superintelligence should not far outstrip our own. He speculates that although it's unlikely that we bodily shall ever escape from our solar system into interstellar space, it's not unlikely that our super robot descendants will, in which case the picture on the right, Carl Sagan's speculation of how advanced civilizations might colonize the galaxy, might apply to our robot descendants, if not to us bodily. Max Tegmark goes on to suggest that we might be the only intelligent life form in the universe. I haven't time to go into that interesting question. I think I'm along with most people in thinking that we probably are not alone, but we could be alone. If we are alone, if there is only one planet in the universe that has produced intelligent life, then it has to be this planet, because here we are. If that's true, then we have a grave responsibility, Tegmark suggests. We carry the flame for intelligence. We mustn't let it die, for it could be that we, or our robot descendants of the future, are the sole representatives in the galaxy of physical objects that are capable of thinking, inventing, creating, understanding, who knows, even perhaps feeling. I am saddened by the thought that there will come a time when nobody is left to appreciate Shakespeare or Schubert. One slight consolation is a cosmic tombstone sent into deep space, like the one devised by Carl Sagan, in the vain hope that it might be picked up eventually by aliens capable of deciphering it, a very vain hope. But another possibility is that beyond the time when carbon-based life is no longer possible on our planet, our silicon-based descendants might continue to carry the torch of human intelligence into the far wastes of space and time. Could an advanced robot be moved, presumably not literally moved to tears, but still deeply moved by a Beethoven quartet? Others at this conference are better qualified than I am to speculate on such matters, but I wouldn't rule it out. Thank you very much.